Welcome to Roundabout Oxford, a podcast from the University of Mississippi Libraries.
This is Christina Streeter, and I have a story for you, dear listeners. Last spring, a student reporter interviewed me for a class assignment. We were sitting in my office in the basement of the J.D. Williams Library, and it was a perfectly normal interview, mostly about what I do in my everyday job. A completely ordinary interview, that is, until the very last question. "Do you think there's something here?" he asked. "Something strange here in the library?" "Oh, what do you mean?" I asked. "Have you ever felt like something is here with you, when you're alone in the building?" I looked at him and realized he wasn't joking. In fact, he was quite serious. I paused a moment before asking my own question. "You mean, after the library is closed and everyone is gone, when the building's empty and I'm walking around in the quiet, you're wondering if anything unexplained ever occurred?" The young reporter's eyes were wide as he leaned forward, waiting for my answer. No, I answered. "I've never felt a presence." The reporter's shoulders sagged, and I actually felt a pang of disappointment myself. Libraries, I suppose, seem like they should be haunted. They're usually old, large, and drafty, with shadowy nooks and echoey stairwells. So to be honest, that vibe does kind of get in my head as I walk through the library at night, alone, in the quiet. Perhaps the air conditioning system does sound a little like whispers. And why is the air suddenly freezing cold? And are those my footsteps I hear? Or what was that shadowy movement behind that bookshelf? It has to be a trick of the moonlight, or could it be something from the beyond? On this episode of Roundabout Oxford, we explore humans' fascination with the dark and the unknown. Stay tuned.
This is Abbie Norris, the Digital Initiatives Librarian at the University of Mississippi. I'm here interviewing Lee Harper, a local artist and the creator of History Bones, a project that blends a love of history with a design that's been focused on for centuries: skeletons. So Lee, I'm curious, how did you get started as an artist?
Well, I've painted and drawn and done illustrations since, honestly, I was little. Went to art school, thought I would do graphic design or something like that. I honestly did not know exactly what I was going to do. But I ended up just doing freelance painting and making things for people, whatever they needed. A lot of custom painting and, illustrations for print. And somehow I've been able to make a living at that.
And you have a series and a website called History Bones. Can you tell me a little bit more about that project and how you got it started, and maybe describe what the installations in the series look like?
Yes, actually, about 15 years ago, I took a bare-naked skeleton at Halloween, and as kind of a middle finger to Elf on the Shelf, who I cannot stand because he spies on you and tattles on you, I thought this will be hilarious to have a skeleton for the week of Halloween do stuff for just my child. It was just here, right? Well, one day he got a hat, and then I thought, oh my God, this would be hilarious to do such and such to it. And it was just fun, just everyday kind of funny stuff. And that was the week of Halloween for probably 5 years. And every year it got more and more intricate. It was just a family thing. Well, I didn't realize my husband was putting them on Facebook, and people actually liked them. I could not believe it. And so after a while, when I realized, wait, I'm way more into this than the kids are, I kind of commandeered it. And I thought, I'm going to do history scenes, like for people even like me, I mean, I wasn't even interested in history while I was in school, which is hilarious because now I'm obsessed with it. So the very first history one I did was Lincoln and his wife at the play, with John Wilkes Booth coming up behind them with the gun pointed, and that moment before he shot, knowing that history would forever be changed in that couple of seconds, is fascinating to me. You know what I mean? Honestly, the only reason they were in miniature was obviously because the skeleton I started with was small, right? I've never thought of myself as a miniaturist, or like, hey, let's do some miniatures, or hey, let's do some history dioramas, never. But it slowly evolved over years, and they just got more and more intricate. And I found myself, I was absolutely loving working on these, and I'd work on them way more than just Halloween week, because frankly, they took a long time to make. But they were still just for fun. And finally, I had a friend say, put these on social media. I was like, what? Because at the time, I barely answered email. So I put History Bones up on Instagram, and I could not believe, like, it got a great response. And, it's everything from, like, really macabre stuff to, honestly, like, incredible people who have just been forgotten by history that frankly need to be remembered and could have their own movies. There's so little room for things to be written down in the history that we all know. Honestly, if I read about it and it's really interesting, I'll just figure out a way. If it's interesting enough, because they take so long, it has to be very interesting. Because still, it's for me, it's for fun. Mm-hmm. But it's really fun, I have to say. It lets me feed my genealogy and researcher and maker of things, personalities all together. It lets me marry all those things.
You mentioned that you have done a variety of scenes, both ones that are a little more macabre, but then also ones that are just regular everyday people. With mm-hmm. both of those, how do you feel interpreting those stories and those scenes using skeletons affects the way that you tell those stories?
I've thought about this a lot. And yes, of course, it did start with Halloween. But when I started digging into it, and of course I was somewhat familiar with these things already, but for thousands of years, art has used skeletons with like Dance Macabre, Memento Mori, Day of the Dead. There's loads of examples. And to me, the skeletons kind of represent everybody, dead, alive, whatever race, whatever background, whatever gender, it doesn't matter. And until, honestly, if I told the story and didn't dress the skeleton, it's kind of fun to think about people guessing, was this a man or a woman or whatever it was? Because some of them are very surprising. But I think they represent a timelessness, and some of my favorite ones, like I have one of the catacombs, and there's a monk dusting the bones, and he's a skeleton. This is going to be you, the whole Memento Mori thing, do what you can while you're here, because you're going to end up just like this as well. I just find that really fascinating.
Are there any projects you're currently working on that you want to highlight or talk about?
I actually do have a book I'm working on with my photographer friend from New Orleans, Pablo Johnson. I've been making miniature replicas of places that were very special and sentimental to Oxonians that are not here anymore, like the Hoka and the Gin. We have put that together in a little bitty book that should be available in the next few weeks. And everything in it except one are places that do not exist here anymore, which as a quote unquote historian, I love that, kind of bringing them back. And what's really fun about those is whenever I've posted anything about them, people have the most fun stories and memories that they love telling, and it's a blast, and I'll get little details from them that help me with the piece, like, oh yeah, the back door was broken at this such and such, or you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
There was a cigarette bin, so-and-so. I mean, because we're talking, some of these are from the 70s and 80s, but I love doing pieces like that really bring back a lot of memories. Those have been very fun. It's just a little bitty book. It's called Tiny Oxford. I'm kind of hoping it will turn into a series of sorts. Like this would be volume 1, but you could also do Tiny Mississippi, and because there's so many cool places.
So I guess you just talked about Tiny Oxford. Do you have any other Mississippi-specific projects, or do you feel like your work is influenced by living in Mississippi?
It's hard to put words to it, but I think so. I'm very attracted to kind of Southern Gothic-y type stuff. Something with a little edge to it. Anybody that grew up with me knows that. It's never quite satisfied with just the run-of-the-mill thing, but I'm very interested in little towns, old buildings, the stories behind the places and the people, the stuff that happened there. It almost gets to be like an illness. I had to quit Ancestry.com a while back because I was like a crack addict on it. It's hard to stop digging. I think that contributes to it, being Southern, definitely.
And if our listeners want to find you online, where can they go?
Well, if you want to see History Bones, you can just go straight to historybones.com, the website. The more fun spot to go is History Bones on Instagram, because you not only see the pieces, but I do lots of work in progress shots, behind the scenes stuff. You just never know. It's a lot of stuff.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sitting down for this interview. It was fascinating, and I loved getting to learn more about your art and your story. Thank you so much.
This was fun.
From tiny scenes to the big screen. I'm Christina Streeter, and I recently chatted with local filmmaker Thad Lee about what inspires his work as a screenwriter and producer. We also discuss his newest release, All That We Love Will Be Carried Away, an adaptation of a short story by Stephen King.
When did you finish filming and release the film?
The film was completed this year in February. I think February 22nd was the first screening in South Dakota. And so we have until February 21st of next year to show it publicly. So, but the short story itself was written in 2002, and it was part of a collection called Everything's Eventual.
I understand that your film has actually won a couple awards already in the past year. It's won Best Thriller at the New York Film Awards and 6 awards at the Los Angeles Indie Short Fest. Congratulations on all of that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So for those people who might not know this, Stephen King, well, most people know that he receives a lot of royalties and for film rights for his short stories and for his novels. But some people might not be aware that he has a special program in place for student filmmakers who are interested in, making films. But as we all know, like film rights can be very expensive for stories that are out and that are currently published. But he makes a selection of his short stories available for $1, the cost of $1. Can you kind of talk us through the process of what the name of this program it is and how it works?
I was finishing up a MFA in screenwriting at the University of New Orleans, and I was working on my thesis, almost 10 hours. I was working night and day on the story I was working on. So I would take little breaks when I could. And so Barnes & Noble was having a sale on their Criterion collection. And I always tried to take advantage of that. So I drove over to Metairie to the Barnes & Noble, and I got a few films. And then I just browsed the magazine rack, and they had this magazine that was, I think it was called The Complete Guide to Stephen King. And it was pretty much a anthology of all of his adaptations in film and television of every story that had ever been made. And when I got to the chapter on the Shawshank Redemption, it talked about how the director of that film got his start doing a film called A Dollar Baby called The Woman in Red, Frank Darabont. There was just something about when I read that, it just made me intrigued about this Dollar Baby. So I read up on it, and it found out that what it is Stephen King was a big fan of movies growing up. Once he got really famous and successful and wealthy, he just wanted to have a way to give back to filmmakers. And so he set in place this program where film students could apply for a short story. And if they got it, they'd have to pay $1 for the rights of the story, and they could make the story however they saw fit. And once it was completed, they'd have a year to submit it. And I think the reason $1 is a very generous and interesting offer, but the catch is you can't sell it, and you only have a year to show it. And so, you can't put it on YouTube, you can't get it out there or anything like that. So pretty much if a film festival won't show it, it's not going to be seen. And so there are some catches to it. If you end up putting a lot of money into it, there's a chance no one's going to watch it, and it's not going to be able to open any doors for you, because I think that's what he really wanted, was a chance to give people young in the business who are outsiders a chance to maybe open a few doors that wouldn't otherwise be there, and to show off what they could do with someone else's material, and his material in particular. So I thought it was an interesting and generous offer. And I came back, I had 2 weeks left in school. I had just completed my comps, and I was up in Oxford where I live now. And I was talking to my good friend Carlisle Wolf, who's now my wife, and we were talking about my future. And she was telling me that I needed to get my career back on track, I needed to make a film. And I knew that she was right, but I didn't really have the money to afford to make anything bigger than a short. And so when I started thinking about all the films that I had written, they were all feature-length scripts, and I really couldn't see how I, at the time, could convert them into a short film. And so I was driving home to my parents' house in Hattiesburg for Thanksgiving, and I thought about the guy who did the Shawshank Redemption and how he got his start with A Dollar Baby. So that night I went home and I found the website, the Stephen King website, and I found the link to the Dollar Baby program. They give you about 30 films that you can choose from. And from what I know, I think it changes. It's a rotation. So they won't always be the same films that are there. And so I read the summaries of everyone there. And when I got to All That You Love Will Be Carried Away, it said, a man checks into a Lincoln, Nebraska Motel 6 to find the meaning in his life. And I thought I could do something with that. And so I applied that night, and I found out the next day that I got the story. So I sent the $1 in and signed the contract, and here we are.
So you talked a little bit about being in the FFA program for screenwriting, correct? And
Yes.
Can you talk to us a little bit, how you got from, we kind of know where you are here, but where were you before? Like, what is your origin story in filmmaking?
The first time I ever even thought it would be possible to make a film, I was in the 8th grade biology class at Rowan High School in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And my teacher, Dr. Hughes, ended one class by showing us this movie he made with all of his college friends. It was like a Bigfoot movie, but he and his friends made it themselves. It was like a real mysterious kind of studio horror movie, kind of a comedy too. But I just thought it was unbelievable that he had made a movie. And he told us that he had edited it himself, and he knew how to do it through a computer. And that just kind of stuck in my brain for the next 3 or 4 years. And when I was a senior in high school, I was in a class called Mississippi Writers. Pretty much the whole class was we would read short stories and parts of plays and, parts of novels for writers from Mississippi. And at the end of the class, our teacher told us that we were going to break into groups and we were going to present one writer or a group of writers any way we wanted to. When I got into my group, myself, Mark Mann, and Charlie Wally, I suggested that we should make a movie. And so we made a movie called Factuation of Death of Mississippi Writers. And we picked William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, of course, and two other stories. And we just made this really bizarre movie that really didn't have much to do with writers, but we had a lot of fun just making it up. And one of my friends, his father owned, not his uncle owned a bunch of editing equipment. We were able to make the film and get it out there. It came out a little bit too late to make the deadline for the proper screening, but we showed it at school, and it was a lot of fun to make, and it really just kind of opened up my heart to it, that this was a way that I'd always been writing, but it opened up my way that it was probably going to be in some way my future, in some way beyond just daydreaming. And I remember when I got to Ole Miss the next year, I was an English and philosophy major. They didn't really have a film program. They didn't have a film program at all. They had one class, and Jack Barbera taught it. It was pretty much just a survey. And I saved that for my senior year, and I really enjoyed it. And it was mostly, at the first, it was really just Jack teaching you proper film terms like dolly and, montage and things like that. But he also would show us great films like My Life as a Dog, and he would show us Roman Polanski's short films that he had made before he made it big and stuff like that. And when I finished Ole Miss, I moved out to Los Angeles, just thinking I was going to be making movies in some form. So I started taking acting classes while I worked in restaurants, and I started writing screenplays. I didn't really, at the time, I didn't have a typewriter or a computer. So I wrote everything just into notebooks, and I really never had seen a screenplay before. So to really get started, I went to Tower Records in Marina del Rey, and I bought a copy of the Coen Brothers' Fargo, which had been out not too long ago. And I just kind of used that as a model form of what it looked like. And so I just hand wrote everything, and I hired a typist, and she was my typist for like 2 or 3 years. And I ended up writing probably 8 to 10 screenplays in that time. And my friends liked them, but I really couldn't get them past any sort of agent. They really weren't proper. They weren't tight. They had tons of just format problems, and the spelling was probably terrible. And so I just, the guardians at the door weren't going to let me in at that point in time. So I figured I needed to probably take the next step and learn to make my own films. And so the next summer in 2000, I went to New York, and I went to NYU's summer film workshop at NYU, and just they kind of crammed 2 years of film school into a summer. After that, I went back to LA, and I wrote my first short film called Dinner with Huckleberry Sawyer. And we shot that over a week in different places in Los Angeles. And it came out pretty good, and it played in a few festivals. But around that time, it was around 2002, I decided I wanted to come home and start making movies in Mississippi. And so I moved back down here, and in 2003, I directed my second short film, and it was called October. And it was filmed here in town, and it was actually the first year that the Oxford Film Festival was in existence, and it won Best Short Film that year. And so it had a lot of good momentum behind it. I'm glad I made it, but it was still, I look at it now, and it's still pretty rough. And I even knew that when I made it. And so at that time, I thought my writing could really improve. And so around that time, I started looking at going and getting a screenwriting degree. And so I got into the University of New Orleans, and then I moved down there, and I started my screenwriting degree. About 3 years later, well, there's a band called Blue Mountain, who was from Oxford. Legendary band, probably the best band that ever came out of here. And they got back together right around the time I was finishing up my thesis. And when they got back together in Oxford, I called Carrie and Laurie Stearett, and I asked them if I could make a documentary about them getting back together and this next album they wanted to make. And they said, sure. So I moved back up here to kind of document that. And I never got back down to New Orleans to finish my degree. I filmed Blue Mountain for 6 years. I got a call from UNO, from the head of the MFA department, and they were just letting me know that I'd been gone so long that I'd lost 2 of my 3 years, because after so long, you start to lose your credits. To stop the bleeding, when Blue Mountain broke up again in 2013, I moved back down to New Orleans, but I really had to make up all 3 years. And so it was time for me to really to quit wasting so much time and really start making the films, because I really need to do a really good job of picking my moments and really making the movies that I really feel like I need to make now.
Can you tell us a little bit about the premise of All That You Love Will Be Carried Away?
Yes. The plot is there's a salesman who's been selling various things from grocery store scanners to gourmet foods for the last 20 years. And he's just gotten into a rut, and he's on medication. And currently he's taken his medication in weeks. And he's just come to the conclusion that he can't go on any further. He's got a wife and a daughter, and he loves them dearly, and he doesn't want to leave them, but he's gotten to a point where he just can't go any further in his current state of being. He doesn't want to just be a traveling salesman anymore. And so he has a plan to pull into this Motel 6 in Nebraska during a snowstorm and shoot himself in the hotel room that night. The only thing that's going to stop him, or the only thing that's stopping him from doing it, is he's got a little notebook that he keeps in his pocket, and in it he collects men's room graffiti, all these weird and obscure and crude sayings that he's picked up from all across America. A lot of them are very funny. When he's about to shoot himself, he remembers that he has this notebook in his pocket, and he's afraid that when the authorities, the sheriff, they come the next day to see his body, they're going to find this notebook. And the very last thing he wrote in it was the graffiti he saw earlier that day in a rest stop that was, "All that you love will be carried away." And he's very worried that they're going to assume that that was his suicide note. And if that's his suicide note, then the rest of it's all his thoughts too. And he's going to think that they're going to deduce that he's crazy. And he doesn't want that. And so he has this real dark night of the soul sort of moment with himself where he's really trying to figure out what is he going to do with this notebook? Because in many ways it's become his best friend, his confidant, and is he going to destroy it? He thinks about tearing out the last page, but he can't come to terms with any of them. And he comes up with all these excuses that they're not going to stop the book from being found. And so the last option he has is that he's going to take it outside into the parking lot, and adjacent to the parking lot is a farmer's field, a cornfield. And he's just going to throw the notebook in the field and just let it lie there until someone finds it or until a farmer runs it over. He doesn't even want to do that, and he's trying to come up with a reason not to throw it away. So then he decides that if he can see this light across the field, there's a farmhouse that he keeps having these daydreams about. The snow's starting to pick up, and so the light that he could see earlier is not there anymore. And he wonders if the people that are in that farmhouse, if they've gone to bed and the light's out, or if it's just the wind and the snow that's stopped the light from being able to be visible from where he is. And he decides that if it is the wind, and the wind stops within 60 seconds, he won't throw the book into the field. He won't go back inside and kill himself. Instead, he'll take the book back inside, and he'll start to figure out a way to turn all those weird, crude sayings into a story, and he'll become a writer.
I understand that the majority of the film takes place in Nebraska, but you actually filmed mostly in North Mississippi, a couple other places as well. But can you tell me a little bit about why you made that decision?
Yeah, I was dead set on going to Nebraska at first because I really thought it was important. And so I looked at, and I wanted to do a Motel 6 as well. So I looked at, on Google Maps, I looked at every Motel 6 in Nebraska to see if any of them backed up to a cornfield. And I never, none of them really quite fit the description in the short story. But the deeper I got into that, and when I talked to, my whole crew was going to be based out of either Memphis or Oxford, with the exception of our cinematographer, Matthew Graves, who lives in South Carolina. He was the only person I was bringing in from another state. So I just started thinking about how expensive it was going to be to take everybody in the dead of winter to Nebraska for 10 days. And so then I figured, well, let's just try to see if we can find a Motel 6 around here that's, 3 or 4 hours from Oxford that should be easy for everyone to get to. So I drove to every Motel 6 between Pine Bluff, Arkansas, and Pulaski, Tennessee. And the one in Tennessee was a real contender because it did back up to a cornfield, actually. And the hotel manager there, when I told him I wanted to rent 10 rooms for a week, was all for it, and so he put me in touch with Motel 6 corporate. And, they wanted to know, are you going to be filming any of our other guests? Are you going to get their car tags? Or are you going to have our logo? And so I sent storyboards of what I wanted, and it had all those things in it. And then I sent them a licensing agreement, and I never heard back, which was a blessing because it really made me start thinking about what we had here. And what we have here is Clarksdale and the Delta is very flat. And the Delta really, when I started looking at all these highway pictures of Nebraska, We don't get quite the snow they get, but the Delta is that flat. And I thought that Clarksdale's highways could work for Nebraska highways. Clarksdale has farming galore, so I knew we could find the field. We had to just kind of find a hotel that we could cheat to be the hotel on the field. And there was a hotel here in town, the University Inn, and they were the perfect hotel for us because they let us use their lobby and they let us film outside at the late hours of the night. We were screaming and it was a mess, but no one really seemed to mind. So it was a blessing in disguise. Like I really got lucky. I mean, it was a really hard, ambitious shoot here. I can't even imagine what it would have been like in Pulaski where we knew nobody.
Do you consider yourself a Stephen King fan? Like, are you a fan of reading his novels and short stories?
This is the only prose of his that I've read, but I am a fan. Like of course, The Shawshank Redemption is an incredible film. I love The Shining. I love The Running Man. Yeah, I am a big fan of his.
What film directors do you admire?
Well, I was thinking about that earlier, and I mean, there's so many, and there's so many films that mean a lot to me. Now, we were talking about Pulp Fiction, and I remember being here in Oxford in 1994, and there was a theater here called the Hoka that Ron Shapiro and Barton Siegel ran, and they showed Pulp Fiction like for 4 months straight. Like Barton wouldn't let it go. That was the first movie I saw that I said, I wish I would have made that. Probably my favorite movie is Amadeus. I don't think the only movie I possibly have seen more is Jaws, but I never get tired of Amadeus. And of course, the soundtrack's incredible. And then there's guys like Scorsese, who's so dynamic. He can do a film like Goodfellas and then do a documentary like The Last Waltz. Like, I don't know which one I would choose.
When you're watching film, trying to work on your own screenplays, is there an essence that you see in a good film?
I mean, mainly it has to be entertaining. When I think of like probably my favorite directors, they're brothers, but I mean the Coen brothers make films that are really good. You think about Blood Simple, their first film is just a straight up thriller, and they pull it off with a really low budget. It looks great, it feels great, it's spooky, and then they went from that to Raising Arizona, which is as funny as like a screwball it's as funny as Airplane, but it's really good and it's really tender. I love all their period movies. All their films, like even The Big Lebowski was like a combination of all of those. It was a surreal thriller, screwball comedy, and they pulled it off effortlessly.
Are you working on any films or screenplays currently?
I am working on a documentary about married photographers Maudie Schuyler Clay and Langdon Clay, and it's called Two Lives in Photography. And it's based on the exhibit that was up at the University Museum here in Oxford at the beginning of the year that was a retrospect of both their careers for the first time ever. What we do is we just pretty much just walk through the exhibit, picking out certain photographs, and they tell me the story behind them, what process was used to print it, and it'll probably be the end of the year before it's finished.
For someone who's interested in becoming a filmmaker, for maybe some of our listeners out there that are interested in filmmaking, what advice would you give someone who's just starting out?
Well, I think that the time that we live in is so good for a young filmmaker because the technology is so cheap. You could even use an iPhone. But anyway, my advice would be just to get a camera and find some editing software. I don't think it's too hard to find either a camera or software these days. And I would just suggest just come up with little scenes, little stories, wrangle your friends, talk them into doing it, get a little location and put it together, and then just getting all together later that night and projecting it on a TV or a wall and just having fun watching it and just get better at it and keep doing it.
There's still time to see Thad Lee's adaptation of All That You Love Will Be Carried Away before the end of 2020. It'll be playing at the Virtual Studio Film Festival, set to stream November 6th through the 12th, and at the Southern Shorts Awards, which is a one-day festival on November 14th.
In keeping with the season, the team behind Roundabout Oxford would like to share some recommendations for spooky books, films, and more. Brian Corrigan is a library specialist at the J.D. Williams Library.
My movie recommendation isn't the greatest horror film ever made, but it's one of the most visually striking and unsettling movies I've seen. And outside of the Alien franchise, it's one of the few genuinely scary movies set in space. The movie is Event Horizon, which is also the name of a spaceship in the film. We learn at the beginning that the ship has vanished mysteriously, only to reappear mysteriously somewhere around Neptune. So, in the year 2047, the crew of another ship leaves Earth on a rescue mission, bringing along the designer of the Event Horizon, played by Sam Neill. They dock with the ship and they climb aboard, only to find that the captain and crew are missing. And the captain of the rescue ship, played by Lawrence Fishburne, sets about trying to determine what happened. He learns from Sam Neill's character that the Event Horizon navigates through space by generating an artificial black hole, which it enters and uses as a shortcut through space-time. A black hole, it turns out, is not a very nice place. And as they piece together what happened to the missing crew, they are haunted by nightmarish visions of the ship's fate as it threatens to become their own.
Taylor Fields is a student worker in the Idea Lab at the J.D. Williams Library.
Looking to binge watch a movie series? I'm Taylor Fields, and my recommendation is the Insidious movie series. The movie was directed by James Wan and written by Lee Wannell. The movie stars Lin Shaye and Lee Wannell himself. The first two movies are based on real-life paranormal investigators Ed Warren and Lorraine Warren, which also appeared in James Wan's film The Conjuring. An interesting fact about the movie is that they were released in a sort of confusing way. The first two movies are consecutive and related stories, while the last two are prequels. Now that they are all released, one can officially watch them in chronological order, which starts with Insidious Chapter 3, leading into the last movie release, Insidious: The Last Key. Then the viewer heads into the first movie released, Insidious, and ends the series with Insidious Chapter 2. It's about a family whose son becomes a vessel for ghosts in an astral dimension known as the Further, while he's in a comatose state. The movie is more creepy than it is scary, but it is one of my favorites.
Abbie Norris is the Digital Initiatives Librarian and Assistant Professor at the J.D. Williams Library.
My book recommendation is The Invention of Murder: How the Victorians Reveled in Death and Detection and Created Modern Crime by Judith Flanders. With the enormous popularity of true crime podcasts, docuseries, and media today, one of the most common pushbacks is, why are people so obsessed with true crime now? In reality, people have always been fascinated by the scary, the macabre, and the other. This book dives into how a series of real-life murders transformed a relatively rare occurrence into the focus of Victorian England's entertainment. From Sweeney Todd to Sherlock Holmes to Jack the Ripper, this book blends history, true crime, and literature into a fascinating look at a centuries-old phenomenon. If you're looking for a nonfiction fix, I definitely recommend checking this out. And my movie recommendation isn't your typical Halloween horror film. It's Netflix's newly released I'm Thinking of Ending Things, directed by Charlie Kaufman and starring Jesse Plemons, Jessie Buckley, Toni Collette, and David Thewlis. A young woman travels to meet her boyfriend's parents on their remote farm, and a psychological drama unfolds. What I love about this film is the way in which small details reveal that something is wrong with the world of the story. From disturbing outbursts to amorphous settings and relationships, everything is masterfully off-kilter. Just as rich and eerie are the visual elements, which set the cold and dark Canadian winter against a farmhouse filled with William Morris wallpaper and strange occurrences. The film is available on Netflix and is sure to add a unique twist to your fall movie lineup.
Christina Streeter is a library manager and head of the Idea Lab at the J.D. Williams Library.
There are things in the world scarier than vampires, werewolves, and zombies. For example, censorship. Christina Streeter here, and I'd like to recommend the documentary film Scary Stories, directed by Cody Merrick. This movie covers the story of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, a children's book series authored by Alvin Schwartz and illustrated by Stephen Gammell. The filmmakers sit down with Schwartz's family, horror fans, and even famous authors like R.L. Stine to discuss how they were influenced and inspired by this book series. We learn that there's a rich history behind these tales. All 3 volumes of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark were the most banned books in America during the 1990s. And this is where Scary Stories gets really scary.
Parents reflect on why they thought it was so important to take Schwartz's book off school library shelves. And we get to hear from the school librarians who worked so hard to keep the books on those shelves for their young readers. Scary Stories, the documentary film, is available to stream through the Canopy app, Kanopy. Stream it for free using your University of Mississippi Libraries card.
Alex Watson is an associate professor and research and instruction librarian at the J.D. Williams Library.
Book that I would like to recommend is House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. It's a really strange book, and it may be a little bit abstract for some people to get into, but it's really rewarding and frankly terrifying once you do. The thrust of the story is a house that is larger on the inside than it is on the outside, initially only by a few centimeters, but as the homeowner continues to measure it, the difference between the inside and outside dimensions grows larger and larger. And eventually he finds a hallway that should not exist, that leads into an impossible and ever-growing featureless labyrinth in his house, one that is constantly changing, may or may not contain a minotaur, and is existentially horrifying in a way that's very different from anything I've ever read before and since. The narrative is also really richly layered in that there's an entirely separate story told in the footnotes. There are lengthy appendices, and there are also connections to everything from Norse mythology to the underground tattoo scene in Los Angeles. It really stands completely apart. And I should add that I've been able to get my personal copy of the book signed thanks to the author visiting Square Books just a few years ago. Who knows? He may come back, but they do have copies of it in stock if you're interested in checking it out. As far as movies go, my recommendation is a bit of a cheat because it's less a movie than it is a miniseries. But even if you watch all of the episodes back to back to back, and there are only 10 of them, it still lasts about as long as a good movie. And that suggestion is Over the Garden Wall, which is a cartoon show that aired on Cartoon Network in 2014. It's a really interesting, vibrant show that nevertheless has some really horrifyingly scary bits. It's this strange mishmash of local American folklore, old-time music, aspects from old cartoons that you don't see that much anymore, and it is a really funny and rewarding watch. It also helps that it has an incredible cast, including Elijah Wood and Christopher Lloyd, as well as some other up-and-comers. It has John Cleese and Tim Curry in some minor roles as well. You can stream it digitally, but I prefer to watch it all the way through on my DVD copy, especially since that also lets you watch the pilot, which is almost as good as the individual episodes, bar a few pieces of slight weirdness.
Hopefully you find some of these suggestions intriguing. Please feel free to let the Roundabout Oxford team know if you found any of their suggestions entertaining. Most importantly, have a spooky and safe season, whatever you're reading or watching. Roundabout Oxford was developed and produced by Brian Corrigan, Alan Munchauer, Abbie Norris, Christina Streeter, and Alex Watson with help from Gail Herrera. For more information on guests and topics related to this episode, please visit our website at libraries.olemiss.edu.